For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe.
The Save Ancient Studies Alliance's annual Opening the Ancient World Conference is returning for its third year running in July 2023, and we're recruiting presenters who would like to talk about their research. Our theme this year is Discovery, Science and Technology in the Ancient World, Traditions and Innovations. We are inviting independent scholars and researchers to submit extracts on any ancient culture or topic relevant to this discussion. How did scientific development take place? A paradigm shift or systematic developments in scientific thought? This conference invites you to consider traditions and innovations in discovery, science and technology throughout the ancient world. We would also love you to join this year's keynote speakers for stimulating discussions on these topics. For more information, please visit our website. We look forward to hearing about your work.
Hi, I'm going to answer a few voicemails today, so let's give a listen to some of the more interesting ones here. This one is from someone named Doug. Let's see what Doug has to say.
Hi, Dr. Miano. My name's Doug. I'm one of your Patreon supporters, and I was wondering if it might be fun to take a look at whether or not the Hanging Gardens of Babylon actually existed. As I understand it, there are two schools of thought on that. So I was wondering if you could shed some light. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug. Good question. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The short answer is the Hanging Gardens probably existed, but maybe not in Babylon. Now, Hanging Gardens are a well-known phenomenon in ancient Mesopotamia, with Mesopotamian gardens preceding and succeeding the time we would expect the Hanging Gardens of Babylon to have existed. But the trouble with identifying the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is twofold. First, the main ancient writers that we use to identify the site often confused Middle Eastern cities with each other. They would swap Babylon with Nineveh constantly. Nineveh was sometimes referred to as Old Babylon. So much so that the predominant theory for the location of the Gardens of Babylon is that it is in Nineveh that we should be looking. In ancient Greek lists of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are mentioned. The only problem is, although the legends attribute the Hanging Gardens to the city of Babylon and to King Nebuchadnezzar, there is no mention of the existence of these gardens in any Babylonian records. Now, of course, we don't have that many Babylonian records, but there's no mention of them in the records that we do have. And there is mention of these beautiful gardens that were in the city of Nineveh in Assyria that were created by the king Sennacherib. So that's why some people think that the Hanging Gardens were actually in Nineveh rather than Babylon. The second issue is with the term hanging. The original Greek word that's used is kremastos, and it has a very different meaning compared to our traditional idea of what a hanging garden is. Kremastos referred to artificial slopes that were raised up on terraces of stone and timber in the same shape as a Greek theater, except a full 360 degrees around instead of the traditional 180. Inside this reverse dome, or bowl shape, heaps of soil were scattered and trees were grown. These vaulted terraces may have contained some sort of hill in the middle, or may have simply sloped inward to a point. The ancient writers Strabo, Berosus, and Quintus Curtius Rufus explained that the setting was meant to mimic a mountainside covered in trees, and was even used as a sort of nature preserve, where wild animals were kept and even hunted by the Mesopotamian royalty. Many of the earliest cities in Mesopotamia were founded by nomadic peoples, and the theory goes that these individuals were attempting to recreate some of the wild nature they came from in a more controlled environment, primarily for enjoyment and for religious practices. But what about that image we have of stepped gardens above open-air palaces with water running off the roof? Well, it turns out the actual magic to these Mesopotamian gardens came from an engineering feat known as the Archimedean screw. This screw was really a tube, likely made of brass, that spiraled upwards in a corkscrew fashion. The tube sat at the bottom of the cremastos and was fed by water reservoirs that were artificially created using water diverted from the river or from nearby mountains. With enough water pressure at the bottom of the reservoir, the Archimedean screw would funnel water upwards to the top of the cremastos. From there, the water would trickle through the soil, hydrating all the plant and animal life from top to bottom. Although this screw refers to Archimedes, the famous ancient mathematician and engineer, the invention predates him by at least 200 years. It's likely that Archimedes was the first to describe the mathematical function of the screw, and its name was later attributed to him. So the Garden of Babylon probably did not hang like most people believe, and probably didn't even exist in the city of Babylon. Okay, here's another voicemail. Let's listen in.
My question is, how does one actually go about an archaeological dig? Could you explain the process to us?
All right. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, it's a good one. All right. Well, the first step in the process of an archaeological dig is to, well, first of all, you have to determine your objective, where you're going to dig, why you're going to dig. Some people in the comments have gotten the impression that another thing you do is you determine ahead of time what you're going to find. I don't know why people think this. Well, I do know why people think this, because they say, well, you can't obtain funding unless you agree with the mainstream narrative. But when you're going to do a dig, okay, and you're applying for funding, you don't write, I agree with the mainstream narrative, or I know I'm going to find something that agrees with the mainstream narrative, right? You don't know what you're going to find. You have no idea. You're hoping, and you might have some ideas what could be there, all right? But in, determining your objective, you're like, well, I'm trying to find an answer to this question. That's what you do. Here's a question that I have, and digging here is going to help me answer my question. That's what goes into an application, right? When you are preparing and you're determining your objective. And then after you determine your objective, you obtain funding. Where does funding come from? It may come from a university that you're associated with, or via donations from nonprofit organizations or from individuals. The next step, which really should coincide with the funding, is to obtain all the necessary excavation permits from the local government or from landowners in the area. You can't just go dig because you believe something's there. You have to obtain permits. And you have to submit a proposal that explains the excavation plan, the reason that you are excavating, and your ability to fund the operation. Again, you don't anywhere have to say, oh, I just want you to know I'm only going to find things that agree with the mainstream narrative. No one knows what you're going to find, right? Once that is completed and you have funding, you have to hire research associates and other staff to help you with the excavation. After all, even though you're the lead archaeologist or the dig director, you can't do it alone. And you're also going to have to figure out where you and the crew are going to stay while you're doing the dig, and what you're going to eat, and where you're going to get your tools. Are you going to bring them? Are you going to get things there on location? For the most part, things like a GPS and computers will be brought to the site, and all your staff have to be trained in how to properly record the information that is recovered at the site, and it would be best to have a lab that is prepared, ready to go to examine the artifacts when they're uncovered. The most important and fun step is to actually collect the data. There are excavation seasons, as they're called, which are normally annual summer digs, because you can't do it during the school year, and it lasts about 2 to 4 weeks. That may not seem like a lot of time, but it will provide the archaeologists with enough work for the rest of the year, because you then have to examine everything that you have found. The dig is what most people think about when imagining archaeologists and their work, but as you can see, there's a lot more that goes into it than just digging. While you're doing the dig, the most likely artifacts that you're going to uncover are pottery sherds. That's probably the most likely. And if you're lucky, you may find some coins or other small unbroken items. You are unlikely to find great treasures or a vast library, although everyone hopes that they do find a library. Once the data has been collected, the archaeologists normally stabilize the site, whether that means installing overhead canopies to protect the area or simply backfilling the site. It's all going to depend on the work done and the required state of preservation. The final step is to report your findings. Publish your work in journal articles. This will get the work you've done out there to other researchers who will be able to verify what you have done and then use what you've discovered to support their own papers or just to inform future archaeological digs. All right, let's give another one a listen.
Hi, Dr. Miano. This is Mireia from Barcelona, and my question is, do we know when we started to make water canalizations to irrigate the fields? Do we have a date range, and what would be the earliest example that we know of? Okay, thank you very much.
And thank you, Mireia. Irrigation, yes, our earliest example. I'm going to use a very broad definition of irrigation here. Irrigation is the application of additional water other than rain to facilitate plant growth, to cultivate fields and so forth. So there's all different methods that you can do that, but all of it kind of falls under the umbrella of irrigation. You like my little pun there, umbrella? That just happened off the top of my head. So this could be something as low effort as surface irrigation, where you flood fields, or manual irrigation, you carry water by bucket to the watering site. Then you have localized irrigation, which basically is the application of water to plants through a network of pipes. But then there are advanced forms of irrigation too, like sub-irrigation, which uses a system of ditches and canals to artificially raise and lower the water table. So I'm going to give you the earliest dates we have for numerous types of irrigation, just to give you an idea of what's going on around the world, give you context. So the earliest date we have for the beginning of basic irrigation in the form of field flooding is around 5700 BCE in Egypt, Jordan, Mesopotamia. We have evidence of water supply facilities in Jerusalem dating to 4500 BCE. Evidence of southern Arabian irrigation in Yemen in the form of terraces and runoff agriculture between 4000 and 3000 BCE. And cisterns in Crete from around 3500 BCE. There are also records of artificial basin irrigation along the Nile from around 3100 BCE. Outside of the Fertile Crescent, we have evidence of basic small canals as old as 4500 BCE in Peru. The first dams, we know, were constructed in Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, with the first large-scale dam being created between 2950 and 2690 in Egypt. Irrigation was developed in the Indian subcontinent around 4500 BCE. This no doubt contributed to the growth and expansion of the Indus Valley Civilization, which went on to create more sophisticated irrigation and water storage systems, drainage and sewers. China may have practiced irrigation as early as around 2600 BCE with various waterworks. They're associated with the reign of Yu the Great from the Xia dynasty, but there's a bunch of legendary material in there as well, so it's hard to separate the fact from the fiction. The topic is quite extensive, and the reason we have a long period between the dates is due to the level of sophistication of the irrigation. Remember, our understanding of hydrology and the ability to irrigate are directly connected to our ability to create agrarian societies, which in turn can create cities. It's interesting, the ancient Persian word abadan, which means civilized, is derived from the root word ab, which means water. Okay, here's another interesting question.
Hi, David. Love the show. I really enjoyed your book, Why Ancient Cultures, Ancient History Matters. I've shared that with people, and hopefully it had an impact. But nonetheless, my question has to do with radiocarbon dating. I realize you're not a geologist or anything, but I do know you dip your toe into that field. And a lot of people, especially who defend a kind of young Earth creation, will argue that radiocarbon dating is all well and good until you get to a, I suppose, 3, 4, 5,000 year mark. What is the rebuttal to this? How can we how can we know that radiocarbon dating is more reliable beyond, say, the 5,000 to 7,000 year mark?
Yes, very good question. And you are correct. I I have never done radiocarbon dating, and because I'm not one of the scientists who works on those things, nor am I an archaeologist who submits artifacts to be carbon dated. However, my area of interest is ancient chronology, figuring out when things happened. Dating artifacts is very important in my research, so I've done a lot of study about this. Now, I've done a video already on all the dating techniques done by archaeologists, and I did another video on all the dating techniques done by historians, so you can check those out when you get a chance. But as for this specific question, yes, let's talk about the reliability of carbon dating beyond 5,000 years. So carbon dating works by observing how much a certain carbon isotope, and we're talking about carbon-12, 14, and more recently carbon-13, remains in a plant or animal, something that has been alive. Scientists use these observations to reverse calculate when the plant or animal died. Although radiocarbon dating was invented in the 50s by a man named Willard Libby, scientists have been hard at work improving the original method. Libby used carbon-14 dating as a check on carbon-12 dates, so he could pinpoint the time the plant or animal died. Carbon-14 is an unstable isotope, while carbon-12 is stable. This means that when a plant or animal dies, they stop taking in carbon. During their lifetimes, they were absorbing it. The carbon-14 material, because it's unstable, decays over time, and the carbon-12 material remains unchanged. The difference between the two is exactly how Libby was able to determine the time of death. The accuracy of carbon dating depends on how far back in time we are going. But according to the current science, the dating is useful for up to 50,000 years and is very accurate even at 20,000 years ago. Now, for my purposes, for ancient history purposes, I don't need to go that far back. I only really need to go 5,000 to 6,000 years back because that's kind of when I start, my area. But carbon dating is used for older things as well. In fact, the period in which a sample undergoes one cycle in its half-life is about 5,730 years, which should give you an idea of how long carbon-14 takes to decay. That's the half-life. The main issue today is that fossil fuels release a massive amount of carbon-12, which disrupts the ratio between carbon-12 and carbon-14 in samples, making accurate age determinations harder. This is where carbon-13 comes in. Carbon-13 is not nearly as prevalent in fossil fuels or their emissions, and therefore it can be used to determine if a radiocarbon date can be trusted. If a lower than expected level of carbon-13 is found in an object, this indicates that the radiocarbon date cannot be trusted because it likely contains excess carbon-12 from fossil fuel emissions. Archaeologists can also use the sedimentary layer in which the plant or animal material was recovered to double-check its age. They also use dendrochronology to double-check the age. So carbon dating is still a very reliable method of dating, and the use of carbon-13 should provide some reassurance that carbon dating will remain useful in the future, no matter how much fossil fuel we emit. Though, I'm not encouraging the practice. Okay, let's listen to another one.
Hello, Dr. Miano. Good evening. I am Devajyoti Vishwas, an economics teacher from India. I am mainly interested in economic history, but in recent time, my area of interest grew towards the migration of Indo-European people, their religion, their lifestyle, everything. So while studying that, I came across some scholars' claim that Buddha was a Scythian. I want to know if there is any truth to these claims. Was Buddha indeed a Scythian? Do we have any evidence for such claim? If you cover this particular issue in your video or in your podcast, I will be greatly thankful to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Devajyoti, for your comment, your question. Was the Buddha a Scythian? By the way, I did a video on the Buddha, whether the Buddha existed. So it's another voicemail I answered a little while ago. So you can check that video out too, on whether I think the Buddha existed. And my answer this time is going to be just as nuanced as that one. I'm not going to be like yes or no, right? Because sometimes it's a little bit complicated. Now, despite what people may think, this idea that the Buddha is a Scythian does not just come from some guys on the internet, as Debajyoti said, that he saw it in a scholar's work. There are some scholars who have suggested this. I don't know if they're how definite they are about it, but they've suggested the possibility of it. So let's talk about whether the Buddha might have been a Scythian. Conventional knowledge tells us the Buddha was born in the Licchavi kingdom in present-day Nepal, on the Indian border, somewhere around the 6th or 5th century BCE. The tribe to which the Buddha is said to have belonged was known as the Shakyas. So that's why Buddha is known as Shakyamuni, or the Shakya sage. So if the Buddha was born in the Indian subcontinent, how did the Scythian origin of the Buddha come into the picture? Well, the Buddha's clan, the Shakyas, gives us a hint. Some scholars have suggested that since Shakyas sounds similar to Sakas, which was the Iranian and Sanskrit term for Scythians, the Buddha may have had Scythian ancestry. There are theories provided to support this hypothesis besides the similar sounding words, but before we discuss whether these are valid, let's talk briefly about who the Scythians were. The Scythians were a group of ancient nomadic peoples who lived in the Eurasian steppe from around the 9th century BCE to the 4th century CE. They were known for their exceptional horsemanship and the mastery of archery. The Scythians were organized into clans or tribes, each with its own leader or chieftain. They were skilled warriors and frequently engaged in warfare, both with other Scythian tribes and with neighboring settled urban civilizations. The Scythians were also known for their art, and particularly their intricate gold jewelry and metalwork. They didn't leave any written records, though, of their history, so much of what we know about them comes from the accounts of ancient Greeks and Persians and Chinese people, historians and travelers usually. We do know that the Scythians spoke an Iranic language. The Persians referred to them as Saka, a term we also find in Sanskrit sources, but there's a debate among modern scholars if Saka refers to the Scythians in general or to a particular tribe of Scythians who lived in Central Asia, north of Iran and present-day Afghanistan. But it is agreed that Sakas were Scythians. Scholars who propose the Buddha had Scythian origins suggest that the Scythians moved from Central Asia and settled in the foothills of the Himalayas. Sanskrit texts during the early Vedic period make no reference to the Shakya tribe. This led some historians to believe that Shakyas must have arrived in India later than that, maybe in the later Vedic period between 1000 and 500 BCE. Buddha and his ancestors must have been born during this period, they say, hence later Sanskrit texts mention the Shakyas. Historians who favor Buddha's Scythian origin say that the term Shakya and Saka, sounding similar, is not a coincidence. Both have the same root sak, which means competent or strong. The Ambata Sutta, which is a Theravada Buddhist text, suggests the Shakyas were fierce, harsh, touchy, and argumentative. And that matches with Herodotus' description of the Scythian nomads that the Greeks encountered being the same way. But all we've got here are similar sounding names and characteristics, but they're very general characteristics. Is this enough? Now, some linguists disagree about the origin of the term Shakya. They suggest that Shakya is derived from the Saka tree, which could be either a teak tree or a sal tree, but the sal tree is native to the Himalayan region and the teak tree is not, so the chances are that the sak refers to the sal tree, if it refers to a tree, and the term Shakya comes from the Sanskrit term for a branch, shakha. You know, the tree is revered in Buddhism, and the Buddha is said to have achieved enlightenment under the Mahabodhi tree, which was a sacred fig tree. Could it be that the tribe Shakyas got their name from the branches of the sal tree? Maybe, but we can't know for sure. The Mathura lion capital of the Mauryan period documents the arrival of the Sakas The Sakas, not Shakyas, the Sakas, the Scythians. Okay, we call them the Indo-Scythians in this period, in the 2nd century BCE. And there are a number of coins of Indo-Scythian rulers found all over northern India and Pakistan and Afghanistan from that period. In versions of the Ramayana and Mahabharata around the 2nd century CE, we find the mention of Sakas. They are referred to as barbarians, foreign invading hordes at that time. The Satavahanas, under the leadership of Gautamaputra Satkarni, clashed with the Sakas in the western regions of India. And to mark his victory, a Hindu calendar was commemorated in 78 CE, and the epic was known as the Saka era. So this raises the question, if these ancient sources talk extensively about Sakas invading, why didn't they say it earlier? Why would they be silent about Saka arrival a few centuries before, in the time of the Buddha? Okay, now scholars who support the Buddha's Scythian origins propose a number of arguments in support of their hypothesis. Let's take a look at some of the evidence and see how solid it is. Okay, now according to the Ambata Sutta that I mentioned earlier, the Shakyas are descended from King Okaka. The king banishes his half-elder brothers to the Himalayas. The brothers are unable to find wives, so they marry their sisters, and their descendants are the Shakyas. Scholars supporting the Buddha's Scythian origin point out that these kinds of incestuous relationships were frowned upon by the Indo-Aryans of India, but it was common among the Iranic tribes, like Scythians. And there is a similar Scythian legend that exists of a younger brother taking the throne of an elder brother. There's no mention about a sibling marriage, but both the Buddha and his father marry a woman within their gotra. That's the Hindu equivalent of a lineage, which is a practice prohibited in Indo-Aryan society. Could sibling or intra-gotra marriages be a reference to the memory of cousin marriage that was prevalent among some Iranic tribes, like the Scythians? Maybe. But cousin marriages are not unheard of in India. It is looked down upon in Hindu society. The Hindu laws strictly forbid it. But cross-cousin marriage is more common among Dravidians. Even in present-day Nepal, cousin marriages take place. But the communities who practice these things are, like the Balara and the Tamang people, they entered Nepal long after the Shakya kingdom ceased to exist. On the basis of legends of sibling marriage, we can't really conclude that the Shakyas were Iranic people. They could have been non-Indo-Aryan people living in India who may have come under the cultural influence of the Indo-Aryan people because of intermarriage or trade relationships. The intermixing between Indo-Aryan and non-Indo-Aryan tribes in the Himalayan region brings us to our second point, and perhaps the strongest argument in favor of Buddha's Scythian origins, what some historians call the two cultures theory. What is that? Well, scholars suggest that in ancient India, during the Vedic period and the later Vedic period, there were two cultural zones. One based in the Punjab and present-day Haryana, known as the Kuru Panchala complex, and another one centered around Magadha in eastern India. The Vedas were composed in the Kuru Panchala complex, whereas the Magadha region was the hotbed of the Shramanic faiths like Buddhism and Jainism. Scholars suggest the Magadha complex was home to earlier waves of migrants from Central Asia who settled in the region and had a healthy rivalry with those from the Kuru Panchala complex. The Indo-Aryans from the Kuru Panchala belt looked down upon the speech and customs of the Magadha people. While it is true there was a cultural difference between the two groups, there isn't any genetic or archaeological evidence to suggest the Magadha cultural complex consisted of earlier waves of Iranic speakers like the Scythians. It's just an educated guess. I mean, they very well could have been earlier waves of Indo-Aryan people who mixed with the earlier inhabitants of the region. There isn't any linguistic evidence that Iranian languages influenced the Magadha cultural complex. In the absence of this cultural, linguistic, and archaeological evidence, it's difficult to conclude that the ways of Iranic speakers, such as the Scythians, may have settled in the Magadan complex. So I would be a little bit hesitant to make a strong conclusion in that regard. Another argument proposed by the scholars who support the Scythian origins of the Buddha are the parallels drawn between Buddhism and Zoroastrianism. The idea of karma and hell in Buddhism, they postulate, is derived from Zoroastrian sources, where the dead are judged on their actions during their life. This is connected with the Buddhist ideas of nirvana and rebirth. They say that such concepts of Buddhism was inspired from a closer contact with Zoroastrian cultures. But the Buddhist hell, Naraka, comes from a Sanskrit word by the same name. Yama, the god of death and justice, judges the souls of the deceased in the afterlife, and the sins are tallied by his scribe, Chitragupta. Several Hindu texts which predate Buddhism, such as the Shatapatha Brahmana, mention the concept of Naraka. Further evidence from Jain texts suggests the idea of hell was well established in India before the time of the Buddha. This makes it less likely that the concept was imported from Zoroastrians. Some scholars have even suggested that Buddhism was a revolt against Zoroastrianism rather than Hinduism. But we don't know if the Scythians had concepts of rebirth and hell, though we do know they were prevalent in India, because we don't know if the Scythians were Zoroastrian. They probably were not. The idea that Buddhism's core tenets are inspired from Zoroastrianism, a religion which wasn't practiced anywhere near the Himalayas, seems a little far-fetched. Another argument for the Scythian origins of the Buddha relies on the comparison of burial practices between the Buddhists and the Scythians. Scholars who support the Scythian hypothesis say that Buddhist stupas, which are mound-shaped Buddhist holy sites housing the relics of Buddhist monks, are derived from kurgans. Kurgans are round burial mounds which were found in the Eurasian steppes as early as the 5th millennium BCE, and the burial practice continued well into the Middle Ages. Scythian elites also were buried in kurgans. Kurgans were the graves of elite steppe peoples, along with grave goods, jewelry, weapons, horses, and later chariots. They're all put in there. Now, some scholars think that since the stupas are vastly different from Vedic burials, which were square or rectangular in shape, maybe there was an influence from the steppe nomads like the Scythians. The Scythian burial mounds were significantly lower in height than Buddhist stupas, and in fact lower in height than many other burial mounds, kurgans, of the steppe. And the fundamental difference between a kurgan and a stupa is that the kurgan is a burial mound. Buddhist monks are usually cremated. Burial practices are not unheard of. But the Buddha himself was cremated. A stupa is not a place of burial like a kurgan is. The two structures have very different purposes. There were no ashes of the deceased in a kurgan, unlike a stupa. They had actual bodies. So to sum up, a number of arguments for the Scythian origins of the Buddha have been proposed. These include linguistic similarities between the words Sakya and Shakya, customs of marriage, religious concepts, and burial practices. But none of these are conclusive, right? They are all circumstantial. Now, this doesn't mean that the Buddha definitely did not have Scythian origins. It's certainly possible. I'm just saying that the evidence for it isn't very strong. It's a distinct possibility. But it's also just as likely that the Buddha had ancestral origins in the Indian subcontinent than in the Eurasian steppes. So that's kind of where it is right now. Anyway, thank you for your question, and thank everyone for their questions. And if you would like to leave me a question, you can do so at speakpipe.com/David Miano. Just leave me a voicemail, and maybe I'll answer it right here in a video. And if you'd like to do more for the channel, help it out, keep it going, you can do that at patreon.com/World of Antiquity. Or just give me a super thanks. I appreciate you watching all the way to the end, and we'll see you next time.
You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word. So feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.